we have, what is somebody, okay. Okay, in California, we have the 30 by 30 initiative to protect 30% of our ecosystems. We're also in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration from 2020 to 2030. There are at least three 1 trillion tree planting campaigns, one by the World Economic Forum, one by Plant for the Planet, and one by a series of other conservation organizations. And if you go on the internet, it's pretty hard to do that without finding some sort of like click a dollar to plant a tree. So where did we get to this sort of global obsession with tree planting? Well, as you all know, in the news for a long time, but particularly right now, we get bad environmental news every day. And so people are looking for simple solutions. And so the message that has been coming through the media is that we can save the world by planting trees. We hear that, is mind-blowing. It's just there's mind-blowing option to tackle the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, also that we can help social issues. But as this has come out, at the same time, there's been a lot of critique about what we can actually achieve through tree planting. And so there's this sort of also a whole series of articles about like why tree planting won't save us. And I have been amongst those people in that critique. I had a paper in 2020 in Science sort of saying tree planting is not a simple solution. And so, trying to outline what we can and can't achieve from these massive tree planting efforts. So why is this whole tree planting, why is it so complicated and somewhat controversial? Well, there's a lot of benefits that we can get from tree planting. We can enhance carbon and water storage. We can increase landscape connectivity and biodiversity. And in an ideal situation, we actually can engage local and hopefully benefit local communities. However, at the same time, there's a lot of example of negative unintended consequences. For instance, in areas in China, they've done massive reforestation and it has actually reduced water yield because the trees that they plant take up so much water, so it's reduced water supply. There's also people planting trees into native grasslands and then destroying local ecosystems. They also sometimes plant invasive species that then spread into other habitats. And there's also issues where it's actually increased social conflict. And in the worst case scenario, what's happening is like you're displacing people who are using the land for farming, so then they go clear forests elsewhere. So just some examples. There's also a lot of failed efforts. There's a lot of failed efforts because the wrong trees were planted, they weren't maintained. There are situations where there's been very big like social conflicts because they planted trees into places that the locals didn't want the trees. And just generally, there's been some good studies showing that some of these really ambitious efforts have not achieved what was, actually quite a few studies, they haven't achieved what was the goal of the studies. And one example is in Ethiopia. Ethiopia garnered in 2019 a huge amount of public media because they set a Guinness Book of World Records for planting 350 million trees in a day. So actually, about a year or two ago, I had a student who was of Ethiopian heritage who went over to Ethiopia, interviewed a lot of people. And what he found was that, in fact, the government didn't know where most of the trees had been planted. They hadn't been monitoring the trees. And in fact, he was even told that in some cases, the people would just go out and plant trees year after year in the same place and they wouldn't survive. But then you can say, oh, we planted more trees. But obviously, the trees aren't surviving. So that's really quite disturbing. So one of my big efforts over the last 5 years, and I tend to come across as being like anti-tree. I'm not. I'm a restoration ecologist, and I've committed my career to actually trying to restore ecosystems, but trying to be really realistic about what we can and can't achieve with tree planting, and also trying to improve global efforts. So I like to not use the word tree planting. I like to call it tree growing. The reason I call it tree growing is because you can plant a tree, as I've talked about, and it doesn't necessarily grow. If we want benefits that we want, like carbon and water and timber, these trees need to grow for a number of years. We don't just need to dig a hole and put them in the ground. Second of all, the other reason is that trees can grow without being planted. And so really good examples out the door here, the window, the redwoods. The redwoods, you've all seen them, they resprout. There's a lot of other trees that establish on their own. And so we can use these natural processes and to help facilitate forest recovery without actually planting trees. So that's why I use the word tree growing. Tree growing is one of a number of natural, what are referred to as natural climate solutions. And those also include things like various types of wetland restoration, because wetlands sequester a lot of carbon in the soil. Also different types of land management, like better management of grazing and farming systems. And so they're part of that. But when I talk about tree growing, there's sort of three main points. I get to talk to reporters a lot about this, the public, that I like to get across. First of all, we are not going to plant our way out of climate change. Tree growing is one piece of the puzzle, but it is only one piece of the puzzle. This is a graph from One Earth, and you can see this is sort of global carbon emissions, and these are the emissions. And what we really, really need to be doing is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's some papers in some reputable scientific journals that came out sort of saying, oh, we're gonna plant our way out of climate change. There's just no way. Land restoration is one part of the sink. Already the oceans have taken up a lot of carbon here on this side, but we have to reduce fossil fuel emissions very quickly, and not just carbon, but also things like methane. But it's one piece of the puzzle, and we need to be using every piece of the puzzle we have. The other reason that it's not a solution, we can't plant our way out of climate change, is that with fossil fuels, we are burning geologic carbon that has been there for, hundreds of millions of years. We are then saying we're going to put it into forests, but as we all very well know around here, forests are not permanent carbon. They can go up in fire, they can go up in with bark beetle outbreaks. Some of them are dying because of drought stress. A lot of trees are dying because of drought stress in California. So we need to be reducing emissions. Second thing, it's really important to understand, is that we can never, even though I've spent my whole career on restoration, we're never going to totally restore ecosystems. We can get something fairly good back if we do a good job, but the best thing we need, and most important thing, is we need to be protecting intact ecosystems. So when like in the first Trump administration, Trump actually supported planting trees, but he was going to log the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, which is some temperate rainforest with some of the highest carbon values. And so we can't replace these ecosystems. So our first priority should be protecting these forests to begin with, any remnant forest that we have. So, and it's just a lot cheaper, it's a lot more certain to do that. So restoration is sort of a secondary choice in areas that are already degraded. And the third thing that that's really important to understand is that we really need to improve the outcomes of tree growing campaigns. And this means thinking about, why we're restoring trees. I'll talk a little bit about that. People plant trees for different reasons. Where we're planting them makes a lot more sense to plant trees in areas, or regrow forests in areas that aren't as valuable agriculturally to ensure longevity. And then, how we're going about doing that. And so I'm going to talk about that now. So how do we improve that tree growing? So first of all, it's really important to understand that people grow trees for different reasons. There's a lot of focus right now on sequestering carbon, preventing erosion after wildfires around here, conserving biodiversity. People plant trees in cities for shade. A lot of tree planting does for agroforestry. And also a huge amount of tree planting is actually for timber and other wood uses that are not actually going to stay in forests, but they're also important. They're important, a reason to plant trees, because we have, we all use wood and paper and things like that. And so a lot of groups will say, okay, and there was an interesting article that came out a couple years ago that showed that, that actually the most commonly right now, up until, until about 5 years ago, the vast majority of tree planting was for functional values. That's for agroforestry, for wood, for paper products, not as much for biodiversity and carbon, though obviously the carbon market is growing. But the point here is that a lot of groups will say, we're going to do all these things in the same project, and that's simply not possible. There are trade-offs between how you do restoration, depending on if you want to maximize the amount of timber versus if you want to maximize biodiversity. And so it's really important for these groups to begin with, or whoever is doing it, to be really clear on what the goals are, because a lot of organizations right now sort of promise everything. And so just an example of trade-offs and goals This is from as I mentioned, one of my close collaborators from Brazil. Brazil is a huge area that people are trying to do reforestation because it's tropical forests that grow quickly. And also it's a good place to plant in that they were forested before. And so there's a lot of reforestation that's going on, particularly in the Atlantic forest in this area along the eastern part of Brazil. This is the Amazon up here, and this is one of those areas where we need to be protecting the existing forest because it is the largest area of tropical rainforest and very important for both carbon and hydrologic cycling. But anyways, in the Atlantic forest, which was deforested largely when the Portuguese colonized 200 to 300 years ago, there's a lot of restoration being done. But the question is, why are they doing that? Well, there's a number of different reasons. At the global scale, part of their Paris Climate Agreement was to sequester carbon. There's also other groups that are involved saying that they're going to conserve biodiversity. The Brazilian Forest Code, Brazil does have a forest cover law where you have to have a certain percentage of forest cover on land. And that's really focused in their case about water quality. And so that's really at the national level, it's like that. But at the local level, the reforestation tends to be done by farmers, and farmers need to provide food and income. So the species you might plant for biodiversity might be different than like the fruit trees that you might plant the farmers might plant, and they might not be the most fastest growing trees that would sequester more carbon. And so there are these trade-offs of like what your goals are, how you manage it, and what species you plant. And so what they've done there is they actually have this Atlantic Forest Pact, which is a group of about 270 different organizations from science, from government, from NGOs that are working together both on developing better protocols, but also thinking about, how do you balance some of these goals across the landscape. Another thing that to think about is like even, how do you plant trees, as I said, and whether you need to plant trees. So one of the things that we know is that nature does a pretty good job of recovering forests on their own if there are source populations around and they aren't too degraded. And so in tropical forests, there's a lot of species that are dispersed by birds and bats. We around here also have, a lot of wind dispersed species. We also have things like the redwoods that resprout. And so in those cases, you may not actually have to go out and plant. And you can see, this is a site here. This is in Mexico where one of my graduate students worked, and like 3 years after they abandoned from agriculture, not mostly shifting agriculture, so not really intensive, you have a huge amount of natural regeneration. After the fires around here, within a year, if you looked in the mountains around here, there's a lot of natural resprouting that's happening. And so like when people ask me, should we be going out and planting after the CZU fire, my advice is to put your resources into controlling some of the invasive species that are coming in rather than actually planting, because you can see there's a lot of resprouting that's been going on in those areas. So we don't always need to plant trees, but there's also a range of methods that can be used. So we might just allow it to regenerate naturally, as I said. In some cases, people use what's called assisted natural regeneration, which is in this case like to clear around the species that establish naturally, and that'll help those trees grow more. Or here after, as I was saying, after fire, maybe this is at Henry Cowell State Park where they burned in the chaparral. That was actually a managed burn, where it's actually regenerating just fine. So the focus should be on controlling invasive species that might come in. In other cases, the approach might be to do active tree planting. And these are this is an example in Brazil where they did like mixed native tree planting and planted diversity of trees. In other cases, particularly in the tropics, there's examples where it makes a lot more sense to do agroforestry. And you're not actually trying to get the full forest back, but you are trying to benefit the landowner and also plant some trees and increase the sort of structure on the landscape and the habitat value for animals when you have more canopy cover. And obviously, there's times to plant monoculture plantations. It's not what I work on. I'm not a forester, but we need to be producing wood and timber. So that's another approach. And so the point here is how you go about tree growing depends on the goals and the local ecological and social conditions. And so there's a lot of different approaches, and we need to think about which makes the most sense and not look for a one-size-fits-all solution. So as I said, there's been a lot of critique of, a lot of the reforestation efforts that have gone on so far and how they aren't really achieving the goals that we're hoping for. So there's a number of different guidelines that have come out about tree growing best practices and how to do it better. One of this golden rules was one that came out of the Royal Botanical Garden of in England, Kew, and has been quite widely cited. We also had a paper Pedro and I did that came out for sort of how to improve tree planting efforts. And there's a number of different studies that have come out on that. So the general sort of broadly, the guidelines that people talk about is at the first one that it's not come up on the screen. There we go. Okay. So is that, but the question is, are these guidelines actually being practiced? And I'll get back to that in a minute, but first of all, we'll go over what these guidelines are. So first of all, you need clear goals, as I said, because how you do tree growing depends a lot on what your goal is. So you need to have clear goals, and then you need to have project standards to make sure that the projects that you're doing actually meet those goals. Second of all, you need to think about local engagement and benefits. And so particularly in the global south, in the tropics, where a lot of the land that people are proposing to plant into is land that people are living in and using in and gaining income from, how are you going to, those people need something to live off of. Otherwise, they're going to go clear the forest somewhere else, or they're just not all going to disappear. So you need to think about how do you engage locals. And so this may mean coming up with creative solutions. And as I said, a lot of cases in the global south, agroforestry may actually make more sense as an approach. Another approach that one of my graduate students has worked on is the idea of what are called silvopastoral systems. And silvopastoral systems are grazing, looking at trying to do more sustainable cattle grazing. And so what they do is, rather than just having totally clear open areas, is to plant various types of leguminous shrubs and trees into the cattle grazing landscape. It's more intensive management-wise, but it actually is pretty productive in those systems. And so for her work, the idea here is that if you have this mixed-use agricultural landscape, that if you can increase productivity in these areas, increase the habitat value, even though it's still used for agriculture, then hopefully you can take some of these like steeper slopes and less productive lands out of production. And one of my former PhD students, Alicia Kaye, actually found that payments to farmers to help them transition was effective in increasing the tree cover while still providing income. And Alicia has also, since then, has been working for the Nature Conservancy, working to implement some of this work in Colombia and elsewhere. So another criteria is sort of permanence and long-term funding, because as I said, one of the problems with tree growing efforts is that people just plant trees and then they don't really, it's like, let's put the trees in the ground, but they don't really actually look at like, what does it cost and what does it realistically mean over the long term to maintain those trees, because those benefits that we want, those are 10, 20, 50 years down the line. And so doing that means part of improving tree growing efforts is really addressing the causes of deforestation, because if you haven't done that, then they're just going to keep re-clearing those areas or clearing intact forest. And so some of the main causes of deforestation, particularly in the tropics, is cattle ranching for beef. As I said, that's a big one. Soy and clearing lands for soy, and then oil palm is another one. To a lesser degree, timber pulp, and most of the residential urban development that's more in the United States or in the developing world, those types of questions. But really thinking about how we're going to produce this. And this is something to think about in your consumption. One of the best things we can be doing for the climate and for land transitions is to eat lower on the food chain, particularly less beef, because it is particularly land demanding, and also, of course, cattle emit a lot of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. Also thinking about sourcings of things like oil palm and soy, and like where are they coming from, and is it coming from areas with cleared forests? But really thinking about how we're going to reduce those drivers. It also means thinking about increasing longevity, also means thinking about where you do reforestation, and hopefully in areas that are less likely to be re-cleared. So a good example of this from the United States is some work of my colleague Susan Cook Patton at the Nature Conservancy. And what they did was a big assessment in the United States to look at sort of lower cost and more feasible options to restore forests in the US. And so what they did was they looked at things like in protected areas. And then the darker it is, the more more opportunity there is. So in protected areas, in post-burn landscapes, in sort of underutilized pasture lands, areas where you have poor soil conditions, some cases like on the East Coast, one of the big opportunities is to do more reforestation in urban open spaces, or in the Southeast in frequently flooded areas. And so those are areas that are less likely to be profitable for agriculture or other uses. And so trying to think about, where should we invest our money in lands that's more likely to stay and not have a lot of pressure to be re-cleared. And so they did this, and then the other thing that they did that was really good is they actually talked to practitioners about like how feasible it was and really tried to ground truth like how good their maps were, because there's a lot of forest prioritization mapping efforts. And as you can see, the areas where you might most promising vary a lot in the United States, with like in the Western US, a lot of more post-fire and protected areas, whereas like I said, in the Southeast, you've got more urban spaces and flooded areas. Okay, so sort of finishing up our sort of, we've talked about a few of these, like you have to clear goals, local engagement, permanence. Another big sort of best practices include maintenance and monitoring, and how well, are they following up to make sure that the trees that they planted are actually growing or that the forest is recovering. And also, how transparent are different organizations about how well they're doing, and do they share data about, there's a lot of groups out there trying to get people to invest in reforestation, but it's much harder to actually find information about how well they're doing. So that has led to some of the more recent research in my lab on this topic. So in the last 5 years since I published that science paper, I have talked to quite a few different media outlets, about 40 or more, but some of the big ones like The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, about this topic. I've also advised a lot of different groups that are involved in this, this space, because there's a lot of them. One of the big questions that I get asked over and over again is, which of the many groups should I support financially? Or like from the individual groups here, I get asked like, well, which projects on the ground? But when I talk to reporters in particular, they want to know like, well, who should we be supporting? And that's a really hard thing to know as somebody who might be donating to a project or trying to think about, where your investments should go. So my lab started a few years ago, looking at evaluating some of these tree growing organizations to figure out like how well they're doing. And so we did this study where we looked at a number of different tree growing organizations. We have focused on what we call intermediary organizations. And these are some of the larger international organizations. Well, some of them are large, some of them are smaller, that then fund, sometimes they do the reforestation themselves, but they also tend to fund projects either in a region or globally. But we didn't look in, and so these include groups like you're probably familiar with, like Conservation International, Ecosia, which is an online search engine, World Wildlife Fund. There's a whole bunch of them that we do, but then there's some sort of more regional ones. These are just a couple of other ones that we studied. We didn't do like we didn't do every implementing organization because there are thousands of them. And also it would be really tough because of language barriers. My lab, we speak Spanish and Portuguese and English, but, and most of these organizations have web pages in English, but if we got into other countries, it would be really tough to figure out what's going on the ground. So we focused on those. In our first paper that came out on this, what we did is we went to the websites of all those organizations, and we had this series of questions, and we were looking at how well they followed those guidelines that I talked about, for permanence, for transparency, for engaging local stakeholders. It was published in 2024, and it includes my postdoc and then a number of different students, both undergraduate and graduate, who worked on that project. And we we used their website information, and we did about, what should I say up there? We had about 100 organizations that we surveyed. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of these, even these international ones at the higher level. So down below it, there's like thousands. So what did we find? We found that about 90% of these intermediate organizations, not surprisingly, are based in high-income countries, largely in the United States, Europe, sometimes Australia. So in that sense, we were able, and about 65% of the organizations, so this sort of shows their distribution here. This is when they started. A lot of them have started in the last few years, in the last sort of decade or two, in response to all this demand, I think, for carbon and biodiversity. They range quite a bit in size, from some really large organizations to some that are much smaller. They range a lot in their experience and also their scientific expertise. What we found was that nonprofits, they also depend on the type of organization. Some of them are nonprofit organizations, and some of them are for-profit, or they're called like Series B, so they're like socially responsible businesses. And in general, that nonprofit organizations and those with the scientific expertise provided more information on how they follow best practices, and they have clear criteria for how they select projects. And so they seem to be following the best practices better. We also found that most groups said that they engaged the local communities on their projects. And these are some of the things that they talked about, like that social food security, education, income, things like that. So really thinking about, what their benefits were. And so this is the percent of organizations, and you can see a lot of them engage local communities, implementing, less so about half of them in goal setting, planning, maintenance, and monitoring. But what we found a lot was that the organizations, they tended to evaluate things like engagement, which is sort of how many people or how many groups were involved. They didn't really look at like people's income or their sort of overall livelihood or education. How were these projects really affecting the community? And so really it would be better if they looked at those types of things, which are going to affect whether or not people stay engaged in these projects over time. Another thing we looked at was how well they did maintenance monitoring and project longevity. Because as I said, obviously for forests to grow and us to get the benefits, we need to be looking longer term. So this shows like what percentage of organizations had maintenance and monitoring commitments that were longer. A lot of them were pretty unclear about how long the commitment was. Sometimes they would say, okay, well, we're going to plant, and then the locals are responsible for maintaining the trees, which, I mean, in some sense that sounds like it makes sense, but if you're a farmer just at sort of really basic income, you need some financial incentive to keep these trees going and not put it back in agriculture. And then these are the amounts for like longer periods, and you can see the very few organizations had commitments that went beyond 5 years. A lot of the organizations say the right things about follow-up, but the evidence is slim. They do have monitoring plans, but they don't do a lot of monitoring of social outcomes, and their maintenance and monitoring is pretty short-term. We also looked at their funding, and these are, green is like payments to locals, and blue is whether they had long-term funding. And you can see that a lot of them were pretty unclear on how they were going to fund their commitments over time, and like how this was going to last. And so that's really concerning, because if you're just sort of saying, again, we're just going to plant trees, but we have no plan for monitoring, maintenance, or funding, then that is a concern. So a few other things we found are that about a little over 3/4 say that they are concerned about drivers of deforestation and are thinking about how to reduce those. And again, about 3/4 had a plan for sort of how they were going to do that. Another interesting one was that we were really interested in how much money went to these intermediary organizations. Like if you're making a donation to the Nature Conservancy, how much do they take versus how much goes to the actual on-the-ground projects, which is usually a pretty big concern when you're donating money. And it really ranged quite a bit between 44 and 92% of the funding. On average, about 80, this is how much went to the groups on the ground. On average, about 80% went to actual on the ground. And it's reasonable to think that these organizations are going to take a certain cut, because they're the ones who are doing a lot of the advertising, sometimes advising, helping with monitoring, but there's a big range. However, all the data that I just showed, those were based on us looking at their websites, which obviously organizations may or may not choose to share information on their websites, and it's not a perfect way to go about it. So when we did that, we were a little concerned. When I was giving talks about a year ago, everybody would say, like, who should I donate money to? And I'd be like, well, we didn't feel really comfortable putting the names of the organizations that we thought were better out there, because we were going off their publicly facing information, and that could be, there's some flaws to that. So fortunately, we recently got some more funding from the Center for Coastal Resilience here at UCSC, and we are now doing sort of the second round of this, and this is very much being led by my postdoc, Spencer Schubert, and Cole Seither, who just graduated from his undergraduate and is doing a bunch of geographic information system analyses, and again, a team of students that are helping us to compile all the data. And so we are now sending surveys out to these organizations. So over the last, we started in September, so yeah, I guess it's about 5 months now. We have been bugging these organizations and telling them, okay, this time we're gonna share our information, so you really should fill out our surveys so we have the best information from you. So we sent surveys out to about, we sent them to about 130 organizations, and we've gotten about 70 back, which is actually a pretty good response rate. So, but the ones that aren't responding to us, then we just are going to use their web-based information. And then we are partnering with Manga Bay, which is an online environmental news website, and we're gonna be putting up by August, hopefully a little bit sooner, sort of a kind of like a charity navigator for reforestation practices, where we rank them with respect to the degree to which they meet ecological, social, financial sort of best practices, as well as the level of transparency and project permanence. So we're working on that. This is, Manga Bay currently has some projects on there, but they're more local projects, and so we're gonna be coming up with this list for intermediary organizations. The second part of our research that we're involved in right now is that we are doing a GIS analysis. That's Geographic Information Systems, for those of us who are familiar with them. They're like sort of computer mapping systems, and there's a lot of different overall coverages of data. And for projects that are at least 3 years old, we're trying to get as many data as possible about where project locations are located, and then we're looking at to what degree they actually, how much the forest cover actually has gone up over time. It's been an interesting process because a lot of the organizations are pretty skeptical, like they don't necessarily want to share their data. Some of them have been very open. Others, we ultimately are not going to call out people by name in this one. In this particular analysis, we're mostly looking at like how successful have these projects been in increasing tree cover. But we have, after a lot of bugging people and also getting some from a couple of repositories that have data, that we now have about 100, whoops, shoot, I just turned my thing off here. What happened to there? I think I hit the wrong button there. Let's see. Oops. Well, let's try that again. I don't know what happened there. Let me put my glasses on and take a check here and see what happened if I accidentally hit something that screwed it up. It's extended. Let me try trying to hit this again. Did I just turn this off? That's that one. That one. Okay. Oh dear. Let me try. Yeah, no, I have two displays because that's how you extend it. What I don't know is why my thing here just did it. Let me start over. Let me try to see what happens if I try redoing it here. Okay, there we are. We're back in business. Okay, now I probably need to let me share screen. Let me make sure it probably cut it off from the people online. So there we go. Okay, we're back. Okay, so we have about 100,000 hectares of projects. A hectare is 2.5 acres, so think of that as 250,000 acres of projects from 50 organizations, and we are in the process of analyzing those data right now. And so hopefully we will, like I said, we should have most of our results out. We're on a pretty short timeline with this grant, so by August. Anyways, here we go. Okay. So in closing, oh, look at that. Okay. So just a few recommendations that have come out of our work. First of all, for organizations, what we've been really pushing that it's really important is that to establish clear criteria for selecting local implementing organizations. So like when you're choosing projects to support, you have to have clear criteria following best practices for like secure land tenure, community engagement. Also that you need to make long-term monitoring commitments to maintenance and funding and monitoring, and providing more detail to potential funders about outcomes and where their money is going. And I can say that this work has been some of the most satisfying work of my work in research. I do, like I said, I do a lot of ecology research where I do feel like some of my research informs restoration practices, and I work with organizations to try to implement them. But we've actually seen some really concrete progress in the sense that we found organizations that have actually really changed in the last 2 years their protocols to much more closely follow the best practices. And the other thing that's been interesting in doing this survey is that a number of organizations who have filled it out have come back to us and gone, wow, your survey really made us think about what we're doing and how we might improve it. So that's been pretty heartening as a scientist. As for individuals who are donating, in general, more experienced organizations follow best practices guidelines more closely. I would look for sort of, if you're looking at organization, look for more concrete details. They like to show a lot of really flashy videos. They've interviewed with Juan Valdez, the farmer or whatever, who's changed his life, but really looking for more concrete numbers of like what their tree survival rates are or what they're actually monitoring. And hopefully we will have this public, hopefully we will have a public sort of facing website out, which we need to have out by August. So the goal there is to actually, where we actually name organizations and kind of say, what's their score for how, we can't totally evaluate everything they're doing on the ground, but we can at least say, are they following best practices in concept? And with that, I will say thank you. This has been funded largely. I have an endowed chair from the MacArthur Foundation right now that funded the first part of the work, and also by the Center for Coastal Climate Resilience. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. I'll just call people, that's fine.
Let me ask one.
Okay.
So, the forest removal versus forest restoration, who's winning today?
Forest removal by a long shot. We still have, unfortunately, a lot of. Oh, the question was, is forest restoration or forest removal winning? And that's just a really, unfortunately, it's an easy answer. We're losing net forest loss. There's still a lot of deforestation going on, which is why I make the point that we need to be protecting intact forests first and then doing restoration as a second choice. They both need to be going on, but yes, I have a figure that I've shown. I don't, it's another slide deck, but yeah, we are still losing forest cover rapidly, both in the US and globally.
Do you see a balance between the inherent conflict between climate change and reforestation and our need for arable land to support the population and the population growth?
Okay, so the question was, is there a trade-off between, population growth, and I would like to say population growth and consumption. It's not just population growth, it's both. Population growth and consumption, trade-off between that, climate change and reforestation, absolutely. I mean, I could pick any two of those and talk about it, obviously, as we have more people, but it's not just more people, it's the amount that we consume, because we, of course, the footprint of anybody in this room is way higher than somebody in Africa, or in most places in Africa. So both those things, yes, we are, we would, if you go to those footprint calculators, it's like the average American, it would be like 4 Earths we would need to support us. So there's obviously trade-off, and the whole talk was about the trade-off sort of between like needing to support people and then also needing to reforest the land. And so there are some examples like the agroforestry where you can have some win-wins, but even in that case, you're going to reduce, you're not going to get as high biodiversity production in those lands as if you are producing food. And so that was my whole point about the trade-offs, is like what we reforest for, there's trade-offs. And obviously for climate change, as the planet warms, then we have to think about how we do reforestation and what species that we plant. And that's a big question in the restoration literature. Should we be planting the species that are there now, or should we be planting sort of more for species that will survive in the future? And we're definitely moving towards, in the restoration world and in the forestry world, to thinking about, well, what's going to live there 20 to 30 years from now? And we do our best job of predicting, but we don't know, for sure. So yeah, definite trade-offs. Why don't I just call people here? Why don't you go ahead there? Oh, who's got the mic? Okay, so I guess it's whoever's got the mic. Okay, well, I'll let the mic people do it then. Okay, go ahead.
You go first.
Oh, yes, I have a question about Panama. What part of province of Panama did you do your study for reforestation?
In Panama, I had a graduate student who worked very much in the Panama Canal Zone, because they have some interesting studies there where they've looked at different species and the effects of different reforestation species there. I haven't personally done much work there myself, though my project in Costa Rica is right on the Panamanian border, like it's about a kilometer away. It's in very southern Costa Rica. But yeah, there's a bunch of reforestation. If you're interested in reforestation in Panama, Jeff Holl, who's at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, has done a lot of research on reforestation in Panama, and they're doing some pretty big watershed restoration there.
The reason why I asked, I'm from Panama,
Okay.
and for years, from the 60s, my government always have reforestation. We always do that. For me to cut a tree on my property, I have to get permission. If I do a burnt, I have to get permission for environmental. But if you leave the canal zone, that is used to run by the Americans. If you go out, it's a different total thing. If you look at that, if you go in the provinces, you will see a different forestation compared to the canal zone. That being cleared from the sense of the canal. So doing a study there, to me, is not valid.
I would say that just sort of broadening out from that, I think that's very true almost anywhere I can only speak from Latin America where I worked, but the several countries I've worked in Latin America, how well legislation is enforced is very regionally implemented. It's very true in Brazil, where in the Southeast, it's very well enforced. In the Amazon region, it's hardly enforced at all, and it's pretty lawless. In Costa Rica, things are better enforced. They're sort of set up as a model, but you actually find quite a bit of forest reclearing even in Costa Rica, which is sort of held up as the model nation. I just had a PhD student. So as Barry mentioned, I'm in an interdisciplinary department. So even though I'm an ecologist, all my PhD students do some sort of a more social science focused chapter. And he was looking at one of the biggest concerns about reforestation is that more and more with GIS, you're finding that a lot of these forests that we think are regrowing back, they get recleared by farmers. And that's even in Costa Rica, which has strict forest laws, protection laws. And so he was out actually interviewing farmers, sort of asking them why he went and looked at areas that had been recleared and then asked the farmers like why they had recleared. And a lot of times there's a change in like coffee prices, or one of their children comes back from the United States and decides they want to start farming the land. And so there's a lot of forest, we call them forest reversals going on. But I totally agree with you. I don't know Panama particularly well. That's a place where I've mostly worked with colleagues, but definitely the degree of enforcement varies. Look at the United States. How we enforce our environmental laws is incredibly regional. Like California has much stricter laws, and this is only obviously going to get worse under the current administration. Is like if they're going to be enforced at the state level, then they'll get enforced. And so that's just very typical of all environmental regulations.
I hope the next time you go back, I could be your host.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question if any of your students or anyone in your department are looking locally at the Santa Cruz area. And I think a couple years ago, we got $1 million tree grant in Santa Cruz, and Watsonville got a $2 million tree grant. And it's been kind of hard to see what's been happening with that. I think there's a row of I forget what it is, a planting along Pacific Avenue. But overall, I know we've lost a great deal of our canopy. And I know going to city council meetings and so on, they've said that they aren't really monitoring how that loss, what that loss has been of our overall canopy. Anything
I
local?
have not worked, like I said, I've worked more locally in grasslands, and I'd be interested to know, maybe you tell me afterwards about this grant and I could look a little bit more into it. Is it more of an urban forest planting grant?
Yeah, I believe so. And in fact, in Watsonville, it looked like, as far as I could see, that you can see in parks and so on, that they are planting trees that look like they would be, at least trees that would provide carbon sequestration. And in Santa Cruz, I read about the grant, but it's been kind of difficult to.
Okay,
to
I
see what's
don't know
happening.
about that. It's actually paper out here. I should look into that, but I don't know about the reforestation grant here.
I was hoping that about the only thing I can do in terms of this ecological thing is to contribute to organizations that are effective. And I understand why you don't want to, highlight everything, but you said that you were going to have some, I guess at the end of the year, at least some recommendations about who does the best practices. And I was wondering, how can an ordinary person like me get a hold of that list?
You could, so like I said, we're gonna post it through Manga Bay. You could also, pretty easy, you can, my website, this is my website, but you can just go to Holl, that's my last name, .lab.com in like August. Maybe I'll try to remember to send, let me write myself a note here too. I got my notes here. I'll send something, maybe we can put it in the newsletter or something in August. We will be doing a fair amount of promotion when we actually go public with this. I'm a little concerned about saying things right now because I gave a talk, I live in Felton, and I gave a talk there at the library, and I started saying some names of groups, and then it made it into the newspaper, and I was a little bit like, anyways, but when it goes public, that's the whole point of this, is that we're gonna do that. So it's for people like you. I mean, everybody wants to know this question, like who's doing a better job? So yeah, you can check out my website in August, and if you forget, you can just remember, like if you Google Karen Holl, my last name's not very common.
There's a question from Zoomers.
Are you familiar with the Watsonville Community Forest Project or the Watsonville Wetlands Watch? As Santa Cruz tree cover is about 30% in Watsonville, and it was 7% prior to this project starting. Do you study this type of forest project that is urban-based?
Okay, so there's a few parts to that. I do not know the Watsonville Community Forest Project, and it sounds like that might be related to the grant that the other person asked me about. I do know Watsonville Wetland Watch, and I think very highly of their organization. They do a lot of outreach. One thing I want to highlight is there's a bit of an obsession with forests, and so a lot of the work that Watsonville Wetlands Watch has done is with grasslands and wetlands, and also with community outreach. And grasslands are really valuable too from a biodiversity perspective, and they sequester some carbon in their soils. Wetlands are really important for sequestering carbon in their soils, and so there's a lot of value in those types of habitats, and we do have this real strong forest bias and tree bias. And as I said, one of my concerns is like planting into what were once grasslands, because frankly around here, high quality native grasslands are more threatened than forests. And like I said, wetlands are also really important from a standpoint of water quality. There's a lot of value to different types of ecosystems. And there's also obviously in Watsonville having access to nature and things like that's really important. And Watsonville Wetlands Watch has done a lot of work working with local youth and getting them involved. And so I want to as I said, there's different types of natural climate solutions, and there's different values to different habitats. So I think that's most of that question there, but a few different points. Yeah, if I didn't answer, let me know. But I'm going to look into this Watsonville forest one. I don't do a lot of urban planting. That's not, and I should say, again, my expertise is as I said, there's a lot of different reasons to plant trees, but my work is actually on how to restore sort of ecosystems similar to what they were there before, and looking at the ecology of that. I've sort of moved more into this space in the last 5 years because there seemed to be some need to like get some clarity because so much money is going into it. So it's just one component of my research, but I'm not really an urban forestry person. Yes.
Hi.
Okay.
I'm a lecturer, Rachel Carson, and also grow Christmas trees in Corralitos. And I'm interested in the interface between rewilding and restoration. I've been very interested in Isabella Tree's book, Rewilding, and I'm doing rewilding on my farm wildlife sanctuary in Corralitos. So I'm interested in that interface. But more than that, I was wondering if you have any connection with the Christmas tree growers associations, because there are thousands of acres in this country that are devoted to Christmas tree growing. And from firsthand experience with the organizations growing Christmas trees, the people are very conservative, organic phobic. And I have a small model of a wildlife sanctuary tree farm that doesn't have fences. And so there's a huge resource in Christmas tree growing and sustainable practices of actually cutting and then having the trees regrow versus many of the more conservative growers who cut the trees entirely in Oregon and North Carolina and Michigan. And so I think there's a huge resource there for potential, not only wildlife sanctuaries, but sort of mosaic restorations, because that's what I do on my place. And
So maybe I'll go ahead and answer
I was
that.
just wondering if you had any
Yeah.
connection with that resource.
So restoration versus rewilding, as I said, I teach a class, actually, I'm just finishing it this quarter on restoration ecology. I look at, for those of you who don't know, rewilding is another term that's used in the restoration world. And sort of the idea is not just to plant trees, but to rewild processes. And it's a term that's used a lot in Europe, like restoring bison so that they trample and move around, or trying to restore top-down processes like restoring pumas so that they eat, the smaller predators below them. So it's trying to, part of restoration, but it's another term in that rubric. As far as whether I've worked with Christmas tree growers, no, I have not. I do a lot of different types of research, as I said. I can't do it all, and that's not been my personal focus. Completely agree with you that we need to be thinking about mosaic landscapes and how we do that. And that's some of my work in the tropics, is thinking about how we mix sort of more productive land, what people consider more productive land uses with more protectionist, and trying to sort of develop those mosaic landscapes, because that's absolutely what we need to be doing to meet the different needs. But I haven't personally worked with as I said, I can't do everything, so I have not worked with tree farms, and probably won't, because I don't really work in that sort of timber management space. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much. I have two questions. The first one is, I have a friend who is devoting her career to moving trees north, so that as climate change progresses, they will be living in a place where they can survive. Is this a reasonable thing to do? The second question is, in the novel, The Overstory, there's this character who spends decades planting trees, and then, to his horror, discovers that for every little seedling he's put in the ground, logging companies get permission to cut down a big tree. Is this the truth? Because that comes from a novel.
As far as the moving north question, it's a question that's debated a lot, like whether you actively, it's called assisted migration, and it's debated a lot. And I can say that, do I think it's personally, I don't know what your friend's doing, but if they're physically moving trees, it seems a little bit like, I don't know, sort of, bailing a bathtub with a thimble, or it's so small to have to do individual trees. It's a more serious question when you look at the timber industry, and the timber industry, in the Pacific Northwest, is looking at this question, what do we replant with as we're doing restoration? When we do really large scale restoration efforts, we have to think about what's the genetic makeup of the trees that we plant, because we really do, if we're going to invest all that money, we probably should be planting trees that are more adapted to drought stress and warmer temperatures. Everybody chooses what they do, how to make a difference. I would say that I'm not sure that individually transplanting trees and moving them is going to make a huge difference. What we look at in science is what's the ability to disperse, and trying to figure out, when you're doing large scale reforestation or restoration efforts, what's the genetics of it. As far as does planting trees justify logging companies planting? That really depends on where you're working and what the laws are. I can't really make, again, a generalizable, I can't make a generalizable recommendation about what's being done there. Or I don't know, in different areas. when logging companies do log in the United States, they usually, a lot of them do have to do reforestation of more trees to kind of replace them. But there's also a lot of like restoration efforts. I mean, some of these big tree planting efforts that are happening in other places of the world, and they're not being intentional, it's not being used to justify cutting down. Sometimes that, if it's not well planned, that's inadvertent impact, as I said, because if you're displacing people from their land, then they may go clear forest elsewhere. So there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence, and usually the logging companies are themselves responsible for replanting in the United States when they plant, you know, they do
We
that.
have
So
another Zoom.
I have a Zoom question. So how much carbon can be sequestered by planting trees? For example, if 34 gigatons is going into the atmosphere every year, each year, forgive me, how much, oh God, guys, I can't read. I'm kidding. How much can planting trees reduce this? 1 gigaton, yeah, it's gigaton. Are there estimates? Thank you. And this is from Barry B.
There's a ton of papers estimating how much carbon can be sequestered, and one of the reasons that this became so contentious in 2020 was because there was a paper in Science in 2019 that was later had several rebuttals where they did say that we could plant our way out of climate change, which was then rebutted by quite a few different scientists because they were planting trees into grasslands and they were planting trees into lands where people lived. And so how much carbon you can sequester depends on a whole lot of assumptions. It depends on, first of all, you know, are you going to plant into habitats that didn't have trees before? It's called afforestation. I personally don't support that at all, but are you just reforesting? Depends on how many of your trees survive. It depends, we have estimates, but there's a huge amount of variability in the land. Are you planting into lands where people are living or not? Are you just planting into lands? And so it all depends on the assumptions that you make. But as I said, we are not able, and it also depends on how much the trees grows and survive. And as the climate's changing at the same time, there's all these uncertainties. But I'm not a carbon mapper, but there are, like, if you're really interested in that, there are tons of articles about that and what different assumptions you can make. Like I said, the ones that I've seen, you know, somewhere in the 20 to 30% maybe of the carbon. Like I said, you can't do it all because if you follow best practices of like not, you know, just planting trees everywhere and assuming that people are all going to disappear. So those estimates vary a lot depending on the assumptions. I personally feel like, as I said, it's part of the solution, but we should not be using it to justify, okay, I'm going to go, like, I can do whatever I want, and then as far as greenhouse gas consumption, and then I'm just going to plant my way out of it. We really need to be thinking about, okay, how can I reduce my carbon footprints, you know, by changing how I provide my electricity, where I eat on the food chain, how much air travel I do, things like that. I'll keep answering questions. Yeah, if people want me to answer questions, here I am.
I have a question. Is it possible that forestation can increase employment? Can these two things happen together?
Yes, it can, and that's sort of what I said. One of the potential benefits is it can increase, and there's even in the United States, there's like job retraining programs to put people out in restoration. In fact, a lot of my students like do projects through AmeriCorps, which unfortunately I think is on the chopping block right now by the federal government. But you know, so people definitely, that's been one of the arguments that could be made on a lot of the projects that are working in the global South. The idea is that you're going to employ people who were in farming to do reforestation, but that requires ongoing income. And one of the issues, as I said, is that people will often get paid to plant trees, and then like if you're not paying to maintain them or you don't have some other ongoing income, then what are they going to do? They're going to go ahead and re-clear them. And so it's not simple. Finding those strategies for like ongoing employment they're sort of complicated, and that's why, like I showed the example of the sort of more sustainable cattle grazing is like if you can give people some income while they're also doing conservation. But it's definitely, a lot of these reforestation projects say employ less people than if you were, it depends like what the baseline is you're comparing to. If you're talking to a bunch of people who are farming on the land and then you go in and plant trees and you're just kind of doing small scale maintenance, it may not be as much income to them. If the land was already like protected land in the United States, and then you're going out and you're paying people to replant, then yes, it definitely could be part of a job training program. And that's the type of solutions that a lot of these groups are looking for, is like, how are we not causing what's called leakage, which means like moving just the economic activity to somewhere else by providing a solution in that location.
So thank you very much, Karen. We much appreciate what you're doing.